So this episode was nearly an hour long, yo. And we're gonna break it up into 2 episodes. One today and one tomorrow. Now I'm sure many of you who clicked on this already know who Jordan Peterson is. But just in case, here's a brief introduction. Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychologist and professor of psychology known for his rise to fame as a public intellectual and guru to many young men. He inspired millions of men and women through his lectures, interviews, and his books, particularly his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, in which he offers self-help advice based on psychology and philosophy. Now, there are many mainstream media outlets who have biasly labeled him the king of the incels and a divisive figure, as his conservative views and critique of political correctness have gained him a large following. Needless to say, when he speaks, people listen. And today, Piers has him on to share his perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let me tell you, this interview has been up for less than 24 hours and is already sparking controversy, yo. Let's find out why.
I want to start by saying that I'm wrestling with a lot of moral quandaries about this war. And I'm hoping that through our conversation today, we might get to at least have some clarity about the moral quandaries and see if we can work out what we should be thinking about this, because I think it's very complicated and it's got to be nuanced, this conversation. Do you feel any moral quandaries about it?
Well, I don't think you can have a war without moral quandary. I mean, a war is the consequence of an unsolvable moral quandary. And so it's not surprising that the conversation surrounding the war is full of moral quandaries, because if it was straightforward and simple, and if there was an easy path forward, then there wouldn't be a war. I can tell you what I think is going on to the degree that you can reduce it to something quickly explicable. I think Iran is desperate because of the tenuous hold on power that the mullahs now have in Iran, given their own citizens' rebellion. I think they see the Abraham Accords, which were the most significant step forward towards peace in the Middle East for like 75 years. They see the Abraham Accords as an existential threat.
So for those of you who don't know, the Abraham Accords are a set of peace deals between Israel and many Arab countries in the Middle East. Its objective was to encourage these nations to set aside their biases and religious differences and come together to engage in trade, business, and tourism. And it was quite an accomplishment given the tumultuous history of the region. However, not all the countries were enthusiastic about the Abraham Accords, particularly Iran.
This is a last-ditch attempt by the Iranian mullahs to use the Islam against Jews story to prop up their own dismal reign. And so they rattled the chain of their Hamas puppets and said, provoke, and they did. And their hope is that the Israeli response will be so overwhelming that the Arab world turns against them, and maybe even the people who might be inclined to be swayed by a victim narrative in the West, and that the Abraham Accords will fall apart, and that'll be the end of that. And that could happen. And I think I know, insofar as you can know such things, that Saudi Arabia would have signed the Abraham Accords 2 years ago if Biden would have moved a little bit more forthrightly on it. And I think the reason that he didn't and the Democrats didn't was because they didn't want to give Trump any credit for anything that he had attained in his administration. And I think all of that is appalling. And, I see this story of Muslim against Jew being put forward in this propagandistic manner. And I think, well, the Muslim world has to make a choice too, because it doesn't look to me like their proper champions is the government in Iran. And it's not like the Saudis don't have their flaws, and perhaps the rest of the Arab governmental structures, but the Islam world should move in the direction of the Abraham Accords. That would be great for everyone. We could have a real peace. We could have something approximating a union of the Abrahamic people, and I think the accord was named extraordinarily well. Or we could have what we've had for the last 75 years with the Palestinians as perpetual cannon fodder, at the beck and call of those for whom having them be cannon fodder is useful. And so, there's just moral quandaries everywhere there. It's a minefield, but that's what I think is the fundamental reality of the current situation. It's a propaganda war, and there's a lot at stake.
So Jordan's perspective comes as a fresh one on Piers' show, placing the blame primarily on Iran and championing the Abraham Accords put forth by the Trump administration. Next up, he's going to expand on what he sees as a rise of anti-Semitism, as well as make some controversial statements about the Biden and Trump administration.
On October the 7th, Hamas obviously committed a terror attack of appalling magnitude. Where were you when you first heard about it, and what was your instant feeling about it?
Well, my instant feeling was to be sickened by it. I'm also more sensitive to any signs of anti-Semitic catastrophe from studying the Holocaust for the length of time that I did. And I've always regarded Jews as the canary in the coal mine. And I think the reason that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine is because they're a successful minority. You know, and if a culture can tolerate a successful minority, it's pretty damn robust and it's not very resentful. And as soon as a culture starts to get resentful, the Jews make an easy target because they're a minority, and so that's an easy target to begin with. But then they're the minority that has the temerity to be successful. And that really brings the resentful out of the rat holes. And I've seen a rise in anti-Semitism online over the last 3 years that's just stunning to behold, on the right and on the left, but jointly. And then, well, so I was sickened by it, but then I was also immediately suspicious of Iran's role. And I mean, that doesn't require any particular perspicacity on my part. I think it's quite obvious, but that also opens up the rat's nest of the maneuvering, the political maneuvering around the Abraham Accords. Because, you know, I was very ill when the Abraham Accords were signed, and I couldn't or hadn't paid much attention. And when I sort of recovered my ability to see again, I saw that this remarkable peace process had taken place, and I could not understand for the life of me why it wasn't trumpeted on the front page of every newspaper across the world. And I also think that Trump's team should have got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. I cannot see how you could possibly make a counter-argument to that. For all of Trump's flaws and for his administration's flaws, this was a major accomplishment. And I know the Saudis were behind it. You know, they didn't sign it, but it wouldn't have gone forward without their nod and wink. And I believe, that if Biden would have taken the opportunity and been a bit magnanimous in his response to Trump, which he could have been, instead of thinking of him as Satan himself, that he could have enticed the Saudis into a peace accord. And we wouldn't be in this damn situation now. And now we're playing it out the hard way, you know, because the Iranians could win the propaganda war, and they've got, God only knows how many agents they have in the West, you know, promoting the kind of social upheaval that we've seen on the streets in the last few weeks. And so the narrative could go either way. But I'm rooting hard for the Abraham Accords signees, and I hope they have the courage of their convictions, and I hope they can see that their way forward is the most appropriate way forward for the good of the Muslim world. Or what, are we going to stay in some 14th century conflict between the fundamentalist Muslim world and the Jews? Jesus, we've had enough of that, haven't we?
Now, when it comes to uprisings in the West, especially the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we actually did an episode covering everything that's been going down in all the Western countries in the past week, leading to what we think could be World War III. But YouTube thought that was too damn risky, yo. So you can check it out in our Hoyard section and find out what went down. Now, just like many times before, Piers is going to ask his proportionate response question, and Jordan Peterson will analyze it and break it down before giving a response that caused an uprising of backlash against him in the comments.
I also believe that Israel has a fundamental right not just to defend itself after what happened, but has a duty to protect its people, and it has to take that duty obviously very seriously. But if your mission statement, as they've made clear, is to eliminate Hamas completely, and Hamas live in Gaza surrounded by civilians, among civilians, you can only do that. You can only get rid of Hamas with massive civilian casualties. And that's where I have this moral quandary about how much is too much.
Well,
does Israel get a license to do whatever it wants to eliminate Hamas, or should there be a limit? And if so, what is that limit?
Well, I don't think Israel will have a license to do whatever it wants, because what will happen inevitably, and I think if I was an Iranian propagandist, I would be counting on this. Let's imagine that Israel moves against Hamas with its usual effectiveness, and they start winning, you know, in a serious way, and the casualties mount. Well, it's a lot easier to take a victim appreciation stance against a power that's clearly winning. So Israel can't win without accruing losses along the way, because the more they manifest their military superiority, the easier it's going to be for those who cast the Palestinians as victims to gain the moral upper hand. And that doesn't mean I know what Israel should do. I wish I had that wisdom. But what I would like to see happen, in the best of all possible worlds perhaps, would be for the signees of the Abraham Accords to say to Israel, privately first, we're not budging. And then maybe to take a foray into the public and say that, it would be lovely to see Saudi Arabia come out and say, we're going to continue the Abraham Peace Accord process. And then Israel could say, well, if the Abraham Accord holds and we have the probability of expanding it, we can take the risk of not being so devastating in our response to Hamas, and they could back off. But because there'd be a counter victory in it for them. I can't see a better pathway forward than that, and I think that's a potentially realistic pathway, especially because that would also have the side benefit of not allowing Iran to prevail. That's the best I can do on how this might proceed in the most optimistic possible way. The question is, I suppose, and I don't purport to have an answer to this, is the most effective way of combating Hamas military? And part of the answer to that is the military eradication of Hamas even possible? Because as I said, and we can see it unfolding in real time, as Israel's more successful militarily and the casualties mount, the resistance to what they're doing is going to grow.
Yeah.
And so even if they could take out Hamas militarily, which isn't obvious given its interpenetration with the civilian population, all of what's going to be played out is going to be played out on the military front. And we can see that in the rising tide, let's say, of demonstrations around the Western world. And I would say those demonstrations are likely to get larger and more effective in precise proportion to Israel's success on the military side. And so then I would think, well, is there another way of restraining Hamas? And well, that brings us back to the Abraham Accords, because they were the most promising thing that's happened in 7 decades. You know, and it's easy to underestimate what a miracle they were. The people who formulated the Abraham Accords had to fight the State Department. They tried to introduce it under Obama to begin with, right? The notion was, well, maybe we could start the peace process with Israel without putting the Palestinians first. And that had been off the table conceptually in the State Department, as far as I've been informed, forever. And then it was proposed during the Obama era and it was rejected. And then it was proposed during the beginning of the Trump era and rejected, but eventually they carried the day. And then they did do an end run. I think that was actually good for the typical Palestinian, because it put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Palestinian authorities, who are basically tyrants who are more than willing to use their own citizens as cannon fodder. It put a lot of pressure on them to actually do something moving towards a genuine peace, which is why now that's why Iran is so desperate to scuttle the Accords, I think.
After Jordan made these statements, the comments came for him, yo. They accused him of whitewashing the entire situation and never mentioning Israel as a factor for Palestinian suffering. Now, in tomorrow's episode, he will talk about Palestinian suffering, but not in the way you think. And he will also go after what he thinks is Charles Haihong's fake defense of Palestine as well, which will cause several fans to actually turn their back on Jordan Peterson. So stay tuned for that. Check out our Hoyerin episode, and we will see you on the flip side. Peace!